So one or two of you, perhaps in a moment of insanity or boredom, may have chanced across my CV. And sometimes when folks look at it, they kind of wonder what the common strand is. The focus of my research overall is on the development of expertise, specifically in STEM disciplines. And so that has led me into a number of different contexts or settings. I don't do very much work at all in K-12. I do work at undergraduate and at doctoral levels. I also look at training contexts that are for other adult learners, technical colleges, military training, medical training, things of that sort, kind of depending on where the opportunities arise and where there's an opportunity to examine particular questions. So today I'm going to be focusing on the undergraduate aspect of what I've been doing, but it requires, this is the disclaimer. It requires a little bit of a broader introduction to highlight some features that are salient from my disciplinary perspective as an educational psychologist, but also really extends to kind of the broader social structure of adult learning, and particularly university-based learning. So if it seems a little winding, bear with me. I've focused on one particular study and set of studies to kind of dive into in depth, but there's some broader introduction. So with the focus on expertise, I'm going to situate this in the context of STEM, appropriately enough for CREATE. And as I was putting the slide together, it occurred to me that some of these references were a little dated, but then I checked and nothing's changed. So felt okay about it. But we know that from undergraduate programs, attrition rates average around 50%, that an overwhelming majority of undergraduates who do leave STEM majors identify poor instruction as an issue. And 3/4 of people who stay the course and end up earning their bachelor's degree in STEM also indicate that instructional quality was really an issue for them. And as any good self-respecting expertise aficionado, I say, well, what do they know? They're just students. Except that, and to some extent, there is wisdom in you don't know what's actually good for you. But to another extent, you also want to think that perhaps we actually want some of these people to feel like they can accomplish something, that they have in fact learned something, and that they want to go on and continue down some sort of a career pathway, right? That relates to these areas. There's nothing more depression. Oh, you got a degree in physics. That's wonderful. What do you do? Well, I'm a barista, a highly trained barista with a degree in physics, right? So we want to see people continue on. So there's part of it that is, in fact, perhaps concerns about the nature of instruction in an undergraduate STEM endeavor. There may be part of it that is based on student expectations differing from faculty expectations. But at the end of the day, we have both an important aspect of learning as well as an aspect of motivation, which is that we want to see people continue and persist down this path. And so part of what happens and part of the concern is that you have a lot of students that come through and they fail to see how the concepts and skills that they are taught actually pertain to the problems they're asked to solve. And this is a very important disconnect, right? Because let's say that we ask them to solve problems in the STEM discipline that they're focused in. It's not that we were teaching them things about art history and politics. It's that a lot of the time we spend a lot of time teaching concepts and not a lot of time teaching problem solving, especially disciplinary problem solving. So that's something that I'll be speaking about a little bit further. So when we look at this idea of how do you solve a problem in a STEM discipline, most often that shows up as doing research. So fundamentally, there is a need to be teaching people how to do research, even at an undergraduate level. Usually, sometimes we say, well, that's just for doc students. It's really necessary to engage anyone who either has an interest in or who we would hope to inspire an interest in pursuing one of the STEM disciplines as a longer-term career path. Simply understanding what can be read out of the textbook is not enough to get somebody there. And so when we look at research methods courses and the quality of instruction that comes out of research methods courses at the undergraduate level and at the graduate level, we see that there's a very wide range of outcomes. That in terms of comprehension, in terms of achievement, in terms of desire to ever be forced to take another one. So there is a collective concern that balances, on the one hand, I always hesitate to use the word achievement, because achievement is a grade or a test score or degree attainment. But with my focus on expertise, I'm much more concerned about what people learn and what they're able to do with that knowledge and what they choose to do with that knowledge. So learning on the one hand and motivation on the other, not as distinct entities, but as clearly interrelated. So if the goal is to enhance learning motivation, why study expertise? And I would argue that the mechanisms that give rise to expertise are critically informative for how we can go about effectively teaching and motivating students. Because the experts are the ones who did it, who got there. It's not to say that everybody who enrolls in Chemistry 101 needs to be a Nobel Prize winning chemist. But if we want to empower somebody or inspire somebody to perhaps try to attain that goal, it's worthwhile to help them along the path towards expertise, because there are not an infinite number of pathways that lead you toward optimal outcomes. Right? We can't just take a random walk. We can't just take a random walk and end up a gold medal gymnast. I've tried. I tripped over the sidewalk. It didn't go very well. So one of the things we look at is how can we accelerate and improve skill development through instruction, through formalized learning environments? How can we enhance motivation and persistence? And especially, how can we bolster pathways for underrepresented populations who come in with a oftentimes different set of skills and prior experiences that do not put them inherently at a disadvantage, but inherently put them in a different, qualitatively different starting point than many more traditionally well-represented students. So the work that I do, again, sort of spans a little bit of a broader range. And so one of the things that I hope it can be illustrative of the sort of work that I do, and I see we have a flicker there, I don't quite know why, but is to use this model of PASTEUR'S QUADRANT. So back in the glory days of the 90s, Google was just starting up. I had an America Online email account. It's very exciting. There was an argument that we move away from basic research versus applied research. That this was in fact a false dichotomy. Right? That we had people who did classic basic research, like Bohr, who's a mathematician, purely theoretical. Right? We had people like Edison who were doing purely applied research, not breaking new ground in terms of scientific knowledge. But then we had people like Pasteur, Louis Pasteur, who was, in a very practical sense, focused on dealing with issues of microbes, and at the same time developing a whole area of science. And so I try very intentionally to position my work in what we might call PASTEUR'S QUADRANT, where the work focusing on STEM education and workforce development is directly tied to fundamental theoretical issues of learning and motivation. So in order to do this, we have to take a moment to define what we mean by expertise. And I don't know if anybody from the Hale group showed up today, but a lot of times when we talk about expertise in a higher education context, we talk about it in terms of socialization, right? That people socialize into the role of expertise, where people become acculturated, they acquire values, they acquire language, they acquire behaviors, they acquire a set of relationships that facilitate this advancement towards expertise. From a more traditional cognitive lens, expertise focuses much more on acquiring skills and knowledge and habits. Okay? And so the work that I do, I try to situate across these, where I'm looking within a socializing context, but specifically at the knowledge and skills that enable people to move forward into careers and into learning pathways that require mastery within a discipline. So when you have an expert, there are three fundamental cognitive characteristics. The first is that an expert has extensive knowledge. This shouldn't really come as a surprise to anybody. It's hierarchically organized, and it's within a specific domain. So experts have a mental model that is very highly refined and adaptable to conceptualizing and helping to solve problems within a given domain. Second, their working memory, their short-term memory, their ability to hold information in conscious and deliberate reasoning is functionally expanded. So Back in 1956, a guy named Miller was playing with strings of random numbers and said, people can pretty much hold in short-term memory 7 plus or minus 2 digits. Well, it turns out that he kind of forgot that people have a lot of knowledge and experience about how to organize numbers. And so 7 plus or minus 2 doesn't tell us a whole lot when phone numbers are 7 digits long, because we have schemas that help to organize that information. So more recent work has settled on a number closer to 3 plus or minus 1 pieces of information that are held in working memory, which is a very, very small amount, especially when you consider any kind of complex problem that has a lot of moving parts. Expertise provides the cognitive, the knowledge structures to be able to organize that information efficiently and effectively. So if you consider, say for example, an expert air traffic control person, they might be actually able to track like 500 different airplanes that are moving in and out. They have tools and things that that support their work, but mentally, cognitively, they're able to track more information. This becomes very important. And then the last major component for expertise from a cognitive perspective is that procedural knowledge skills are highly automated, which means that not only do they not take up a whole lot of space in working memory, but those skills activate very quickly, without a lot of conscious mental effort, and with little to no self-regulation. They're habits. So when an expert sits down to solve a problem in their area of expertise, their habits of mind not only structure the problem and help to move them forward through a solution to the problem, but it happens without them even being aware that it's happening. It's in the background. And that becomes a critical limitation for the ability of experts to teach, particularly on the fly. Because fundamentally, while experts are excellent at identifying salient issues and at recalling particular events and solving their problems better than anybody else, they're terrible at accurately recalling how they did what they did. And if we consider the notion of a university-based education where we bring in expert biologists, chemists, physicists, engineers who are world-renowned for solving problems, and our strategy for having them teach people how to solve problems like them is just to explain it in a large enrollment lecture kind of course, a lot of information is likely to be lost. So they have a very rigid way that they frame problems. They have a very poor recollection of how they themselves actually solved a given problem. And that perspective makes it very difficult for them to anticipate what learners' needs actually are. When we ask them to do things like estimate how much time it would take a learner to solve a particular problem, an expert might say, oh, it'll probably take them 5 or 10 minutes, per problem. And then, 4 weeks later, there's some poor 20-year-old sitting there scribbling away on paper trying to get it done. So this presents some underlying concerns about the university structure, traditional university structure, and provides some important opportunities to look at how we can effectively help expertise transition from faculty to students. And so the early study that I did, it has a bit of age on it now. We were comparing the ability of experts, intermediates, and novices to accurately explain how they solve problems, and we videotaped them solving these problems. So we had some directly observable anchor points, and we found what's called an intermediate effect, and it's been very extensively documented in medical education. But in this particular case, we were looking at people designing psychology experience, factorial experimental design. And what we found is that the experts and the novices actually recall proportionately less than the people who are sort of in the middle. People who are in the middle have enough knowledge to know what they're doing. They have schematic structures that help them to properly structure the problem, but their skills are not so automated that they're no longer aware of what they're actually doing. Right? So we see this intermediate effect, and it becomes very, very helpful to keep in mind that when we're trying to get information on how experts do what they do, it is not all ready-made. And so a tool set that I make a lot of use of is cognitive task analysis, which you can think of as enhanced interrogation techniques for experts. So experts are, in general, experts tend to omit about 70% of the necessary information to replicate their performance in solving a problem. So cognitive task analysis includes a number of knowledge elicitation strategies. Semi-structured interview plays a large part. We sometimes use some think aloud protocols, provide experts with specific cases and ask them to work their way through. And as with anything academic, it's very tribal. There are many different mutually exclusive camps into which you can fall for this sort of thing. But the type of cognitive task analyses that I find most useful in my work is not actually to capture how any one individual solves his or her problems, but to get several experts, usually 3 seems to be about the optimized number, and look for the convergence, look for the commonalities, look for the basic underlying structure. Because you recall what I said a few minutes ago, there are a finite number of paths to optimal performance. There's not necessarily only one, but there are a finite number, and they tend to be much more similar than different when you get to very high levels of performance. So using multiple experts, finding convergence around the core elements of those procedures, so that we then might harvest that information and do something useful with it, like maybe build it into instruction and into assessment. So the goal is that we want to identify procedures that are effective. We want to identify procedures that do not have missing steps. And we want to identify procedures that do not have steps included that aren't necessary. So we want something efficient, something optimized, something that'll work 90% of the time, right? This is not, nobody claims to take an undergraduate and put them in a position where they're solving world-class problems simply through sort of this direct instruction approach of let's walk you through how to solve this problem. So we're really focusing on entry-level problems. I don't want to say introductory because that implies 101 and simple, but in more of a professional context, looking at entry-level problems and using more elaborated procedures to help them navigate. And so the question is, well, how much does this really help? Well, one of the studies looking at cognitive task analysis turns out to be remarkably representative, is without cognitive task analysis, when asking expert surgeons how they do the work they do, they articulated about 25% of the gold standard steps. So these are actually previously published. They have gold standard procedures for best practice in medicine. On the first round interview, they articulate about 25%. In the second round, go back through, look, here's what you said, here's how we mapped it out. I tend to list a little bit more, get up to about 30%. With cognitive task analysis, the results tend to be much more effective. We're able to pull out more because we're going after tacit or automated knowledge in addition to the readily articulatable knowledge. So would it really matter for instruction? Does it really make a difference how much gets left out of an explanation? And I would argue yes, because if I were in a mathematics course and was informed that then there's a miracle that takes us from step 1 to step 3, I might perhaps be a little lost. Right? And so we've done a fair amount of research looking at the impacts of missing information. And one of the theoretical frameworks that's very tightly oriented to this is cognitive load theory. Cognitive load theory operates from the premise that we have this very, very limited short-term or working memory capacity, that you have to choose very carefully what information gets entered into that short-term memory, because if you overload it, you lose information that's necessary. And if you don't have enough space in working memory to help structure and reinforce schemas as they're encoded into long-term memory, that you might be able to survive the experience, but you don't necessarily learn from the experience. So within cognitive load theory, we have a finite working memory capacity. The processing of information imposes load on that working memory capacity. Prior knowledge allows encoding to be more efficient. So when you have prior knowledge, you're functionally able to fit more in, right? An expert air traffic controller can track 500 airplanes. Somebody who is new to it simply can't, because they have schemas that are developed to efficiently and effectively encode larger amounts of information. The complexity of the subject matter and the novelty of the information that needs to be processed increase the amount of load, increase the proportionate amount of space that's occupied in working memory. And extraneous or unnecessary search and processing increases the level of load, which is the probably overly jargony way of saying that if I force you to try to figure out what happens where a miracle happened, that you're using more of your working memory resources to do that than you are to efficiently and effectively structure and encode the information that you need. And if we overburden, especially through unnecessary or extraneous sources, we exceed capacity, and it leads to performance deficit and a lack of learning. So evidence of this kind of phenomenon, specifically in STEM areas. So way back in 1983, there was a study where they were looking at diagnosticians in medicine, and they were following this diagnostician around as he did grand rounds and analyzing what he did. And then they attended a lecture that he gave for medical students that night. He stands up and explains how to do diagnostics, and at the end of the lecture, the researcher goes up and says, I hate to ask you this, but I followed you around all day. And I watched and listened to all the stuff you did. And I listened to the lecture. And what you said in the lecture has no resemblance to what I watched you do all day. And he said, oh, I know. But I don't know how exactly I do what I do. And I tell them this, and it's logical, and it makes sense, and so it ought to work. Right? But again, we have very finite ways that we can reach a level of optimal performance. Mitch Nathan, who I know is going to be here sometime in the coming weeks, and Tony Petrosino did a study where they found that expertise, content knowledge, can actually disrupt pedagogical content knowledge. That people who are trained how to teach in a particular subject matter actually will fail to implement best teaching practices because they get derailed by their content knowledge, because they get so much into that expert headspace they're no longer able to shape the information in such a way that's effective. We know that experts are very likely to omit decision alternatives and criteria, which have impacts for people being able to solve difficult problems. That one's also out of surgery. We also know that experts are very likely to misrepresent forward reasoning or mental simulation. So the very essence of what it means to be an expert, to be able to think through a problem and reach an answer that has not yet been attained, is the least accurate thing that people can articulate, but probably the most important for something like scientific reasoning. And so a couple years back we did a meta-analysis. We compared all the studies we could find that had cognitive task analysis based instruction versus not, and we found a Hedges G of almost 0.9, which is a pretty robust advantage of CTA-based instruction versus not. So when we go to teach researchers how to do research, when we go to teach undergraduates how to do research, where does the information come from? Well, Sean and Anderson argue that the most common source of content for how we teach people to do research is armchair reflection. I'm a researcher, I know what I'm doing, so I sit and I think and I decide what information the students need to know, and that's what I give them. The other way that we do it, and this shows up much more in graduate education, but also undergraduate research is thankfully a growing endeavor, is we look at modeling and cognitive apprenticeship. But if you look at the foundational work in these areas, there's a fundamental assumption, which is that the mentor is able to accurately and effectively model and articulate the behaviors that the student can then learn. Well, if experts are inaccurate at articulating their behaviors, and if most of the work that's done in research is cognitive rather than physical, there's not a lot there to observe. So it might stand to reason that there is a benefit to helping experts to articulate the knowledge that their students need. So we look at teaching specifically in research. Of course, David Clark's done a whole lot of stuff on control of variable strategy, mostly with younger kids. We also look at some of the European work that's found that explicit communication of experimental design heuristics is effective. So emphases on explicit articulation of strategies for conducting effective research tend to be systematically more effective than withholding that information, intentionally or unintentionally. And then a study that we published in 2010 looking at the first study that we did with biology undergraduates, we found that providing undergrads with cognitive task analysis based lectures, so working with a highly experienced award-winning lecturer, and it was a double-blind study, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute because it also is the next study that we're going to look at. We had him do his lectures his way for randomly selected half of his sections, and our way for randomly selected half of his sections. And what we found was a robust, medium effect size advantage for students writing lab reports. And specifically because this was sort of cookbookish kind of lab stuff. Specifically what we were looking at was their ability to unpack the findings in the discussion section, how to articulate the conclusions, base them in an appropriate manner on the findings. And we had a significant advantage for those students who received the CTA-based instruction there. So again, it's exactly the same person, same room, same clothes, same topic, same lab, same everything, 2 different sets of instruction, different learning outcomes. So we continued on with this study, and one of the things that was from that first study that came out as sort of an incidental, there was a significant difference in the level of attrition between the treatment and control groups. In fact, in that particular sample, people were 7 times more likely to drop out of the control condition than the treatment. All right. And so that led to the question of, well, what's going on? Because we did a cognitive load-based intervention. And for those of you who may be familiar with cognitive load theory, you know that's a pretty typical cold cognition view of the world. Right? There's information that needs to come in, there needs to be enough space for the information, we encode the information, and then you have it. Right? So we said, well, what's going on that we see outcomes associated with motivation that are the result not only of sort of a purely cognitive intervention, but one that was delivered in a double-blind way. Literally, the students didn't know that there was a different way. They didn't know there was a study. Right? The University of South Carolina IRB standard at the time was just don't kill anybody. So we had students who were participating in this large randomized trial and had no idea, and yet we see these motivational differences for what we thought were very, very small changes to basically the lecture script, right? And so when we look at motivation, there are three major indices of motivation. They've been around for quite a while, right? One is what goals do people select. One is how much effort do people invest, and the other is how much do they persist, which is to say how long will they continue to invest effort until they achieve the goal. Well, central to these to the mental effort and persistence pieces is the work of working memory, right? Mental effort being the conscious, non-automated processing of information. How much effort do you put in is how much information are you trying to process, and persistence, are you willing to stick with that effortful processing until you realize the goal, right? So it turns out that there is this nexus, this linkage between this cognitive load, cold cognitive load construct, and key outcomes of motivation. And so when we turn to the literature, we see that there actually is some fairly long-standing association between the amount of mental effort that somebody putting in, or factors that influence mental effort, and motivational outcomes. Because remember, the more prior knowledge you have, the more expert you are, the less effortful the processing of a given set of information, right? So we know that high levels of extraneous cognitive load or overload are associated with low motivation and low persistence. We know that prior knowledge decreases cognitive load. We also know that prior knowledge predicts interest and task value, which are major drivers of goal selection. We know that prior knowledge predicts self-efficacy, which is a major driver of effort. And we know that prior knowledge also predicts persistence. Right? The more prior knowledge you have coming in, the less likely you are to drop out. So the research question, and I'm hoping any day that under review kicks over to an in-press. I think we're there, but we'll see. The question is, can a manipulation of cognitive load that's undetected by undergraduates predict a change in post-instruction motivational states independent of learning outcomes? Right? Because the first explanation of a motivation change that's coupled with the motivation change in a learning gain, right, is that people are more motivated and feel more confident, they feel more efficacious because they learned something. That makes sense. But it may be that the learning and the motivation change are not collinear. So using this notion of cognitive load theory with mental load, mental effort, when we're looking at the ratio of effort, of invested effort to the amount of information that you can sustain, is one way of conceptualizing learning effectiveness, which is to say there's an optimization point. If you have more load than working memory can handle, you're going to miss stuff. If you have too little load, you're bored, you don't care, it's not challenging, there's nothing new happening cognitively. And so we want kind of this optimization ratio. We also believe that self-efficacy beliefs guide effort. So you invest more effort where you believe you can be successful. Okay? So this Introduction to Cellular Biology, it's a traditional large lecture, lab sections taught by graduate TAs kind of model. We ended up over 5 semesters worth of implementations with over 2,000 participants. And we basically used an analysis that was a hierarchical linear model to account for the nesting within sections, but it was basically a Mankova, multivariate analysis of covariance, where we were looking at the outcomes as a function of this blindly delivered intervention. So we did a cognitive task analysis with 3 expert experimental biologists. We derived a set of information, converted them into videos. So we had the same instructor. We had him do a series of short lectures that were required to be watched by students before they went to lab. So they'd log into the LMS, so we knew that we did it. They'd watch a video. The video was a 5 to 10 minute lecturette that was focused on relevant steps of the scientific inquiry process. We had him record all of his lectures first, and then we gave him scripts and said, now do it our way. We recorded those. So that was delivered via internet. And we randomly assigned which version of the videos the different lab sections got. Neither the students nor the graduate TAs who led the lab sections knew that there was a study going on. Graduate TAs were given the same set of videos as the students, so there wasn't, we didn't have to worry about contamination that way. Here's just a quick example of what a cognitive task analysis looks like. Right? And I'll just point out a couple of key features. We have action steps, like number 1, do this thing, and we have decision points. If this is the situation, then do this. And we can have nested ifs, right? So those of you who have done a little bit of computer programming, this may look familiar. It's sort of protocode. The goal is to try to capture the full branching decision tree with making explicit all of the criteria that identify the decision point and that allow you to make the decision about which branch to go down. Okay, so they get fairly information intensive, but there's sort of an art form to then kicking that over into a lecture that doesn't overwhelm people. But this is the kind of information that we captured. In terms of data, we measured scientific reasoning ability. We made sure to capture gender to control for any possible gender differences. And we captured task value and self-efficacy using the MSLQ scale. At the end of the semester, we once again collected self-efficacy and task value, and we measured learning outcomes. We collected the lab reports that had been written. We had them scored blindly by people who had a graduate degree in the subject matter and were trained to a high level of reliability on the rubric. And generated the scores. You can see that our G-theory generalizability was pretty good. By Planck, no lower than 0.7, and the highest was 0.86. So that's how we set it up, and then we let it play out. And so the first thing we want to look at is performance outcomes. Were there differences in the performance on these lab reports that the students were forced to write? And so when we look at the covariance, so the table at the top, right, these are the variance accounted for by covariance. And you can see that the amount of variance that's accounted for by covariance is lower in several cases for the treatment group than it is for the control group. And that in and of itself is kind of interesting. Why would it be that your scientific reasoning score accounts for less variance in the treatment condition than the control? Well, it could be because you're not relying on reasoning ability as much as you're relying on knowing how to actually solve the problem. In classic cognitive psychology, we might say that instead of forcing students to rely on weak methods, we are empowering them to rely upon strong methods. And so there were 4 main factors in the score. So there are multiple Plancks per factor for the different pieces of the lab report. So we looked at how well they framed the study, how well they framed the hypotheses and set them up, how well they analyzed and presented the results, and then how well they discussed. Now these labs were fairly cookbook labs. So the only place that people really had free rein to just exhibit their own abilities, their own knowledge base, was in the discussion factor. Okay? And so what we saw in terms of performance was a mean difference of 0.45. So it's a small effect size. Cohen's D is 0.36. So it's not huge, it's not overwhelming, but for an intervention that took less than 10 minutes a week and that nobody noticed, may be okay.
What is the Lawson test book?
Lawson's test it's the Lawson's test of scientific reasoning. It was originally developed as sort of a neo-Piagetian set of tasks. It's 25 multiple choice items.
So this is sort of general scientific reasoning.
Yes.
Of the variable.
Yes, and it actually correlates at 0.5 with the ACT test of science reasoning, which is structured very, very differently. So there, originally I was very down on Lawson's, thinking it was a rather impoverished view of scientific reasoning, again being kind of Piagetian tasks, but it turns out it actually correlates pretty robustly from my own studies with ACT test of science reasoning, which is all based in read an excerpt of this article and decide whether or not the conclusion is well justified. All right, so then we looked at self-efficacy and task value. So at the end of the semester, we're looking for change, and here you can see that the variance accounted for by the covariates is almost identical. So we had big differences in what covariates accounted for variance by treatment in terms of the learning outcomes. We have virtually no differences in terms of the motivation outcomes. But what we did find was that self-efficacy was significantly higher in the treatment condition. People came out feeling more capable in their ability to do these things. Cohen's d 0.54, so a medium effect. Okay. But again, maybe we could explain the gain in self-efficacy just as a function of the knowledge gains. I ended up learning more, therefore I feel more confident. So now comes the last Mankova, where we controlled not only for our usual list of covariates, looking at self-efficacy, but we also controlled for the score on the lab report. And what you can see is that we got a significant difference, that self-efficacy was significantly higher at verging on a large effect size, Cohen's d 0.6, right? So we have a larger magnitude effect on self-efficacy net of performance gains, right? Which could be surprising, particularly from a cognitive load framework where we don't worry about motivation, which is a strategic error, I think, and also coming from a model where motivation is based in knowledge. So one other thing that we found was that the attrition rate still significantly differed, that we had significantly more people dropping out of the control condition than the treatment. Well, why would we have all of these motivation-linked differences from a blinded cognitive intervention? And so the argument that I would make is that people are aware of how hard they work, that we experience the exercise of working memory, cognitive load, invested mental effort, and we might draw inferences about our own ability as a function of how hard it is to get where we need to get. So if you have extraneous load, if we force people to search for steps that were left out of explanation, perhaps that's not impacting just their learning. Perhaps that's also impacting their perceptions of their learning or the conclusions that they reach about how capable they are of doing this kind of work. Yes?
I probably just missed this. Did you say what the correlation was between the increase in self-efficacy associated with your treatment condition and performance, achievement, whatever?
I didn't say it, but it's there. So in the treatment condition, the big factor we were looking at, discussion, which is the one that was going to have the most representative outcome, it represented 0.2% of the variance in the treatment and 0.1% of variance in the control.
I mean, is it possible that you have an increased sense of false sense of self-efficacy because you've given a lot of production rules, the if-then stuff to mechanically follow?
It's possible, but because of the way that we delivered the instruction, it wasn't like we said, you people over here are getting all of this information and you people over here are not. It was just the information they got. So yeah, I mean, it's a point for consideration and discussion, because I understand the question, and it is something that's important. So we see these motivation issues. So the CTA-based instruction was very subtle. The only systematic difference was the specificity of the information that was provided. So it wasn't even that we just never told you how to do X. It's that we didn't give you the step-by-step. We said, you need to do X in the control, and then step-by-step, here's how to do the Y. Explicit guidance, we know, reduces extraneous load, and so it's associated with important motivation outcomes. So the performance on the report actually accounts for very little instruction. There's your point. Performance accounts for very little variance in the post-instruction self-efficacy measures. The manipulation of cognitive load is the most likely source because it was a tightly controlled study, double-blind. It's the only thing that we manipulated across 5 semesters, 40-some sections, and over 2,000 undergrads. So we might conclude that more explicit instruction leads to fewer knowledge gaps, requiring less reliance on trial and error and informal support networks. So what does that mean for the rest of the world? Well, it means that looking at expertise and trying to work with experts to more effectively elicit expert knowledge and then help experts to frame it in a way that is more educationally effective may be a very good way to go. It may increase achievement, it may increase motivation, right? Which then helps with our educational goals, our STEM education, STEM workforce goals. It suggests at a theoretical level that maybe the cold cognitive view of cognitive load theory is not as informative or helpful as we might like, and that in fact there's a well-grounded basis for examining the nexus between cognitive load as a phenomenon and motivational beliefs as a phenomenon. And it raises these very basic causal questions. But we generally want something more than lectures. Right? I've just illustrated some very interesting results from what's held up as probably the most demonized form of higher education instruction. This did not escape my attention. And so there's a different project that we've been working on, and I'm going to highlight it quickly. We don't have our results yet. It was 3 years of software development. We just finished executing the pilot, and maybe when I get back to Logan, my grad students will have a nice surprise for me. But we don't have the final outcomes yet. So we took cognitive task analysis of wastewater treatment operators. So that's typically a technical college training program. There is a huge range of educational background from people who go into this field, because very few people grow up saying, when I grow up I want to treat wastewater. And the range of prior educational experience stretches from GED to Masters in Environmental Engineering. And they're all doing the same job for the same pay in the same place. The way that a lot of that training works is technical college, and there's one small, and a lot of it is sort of apprenticeship based. You do some classes, but then you go and you work on a site. There's only one problem with that. They estimate that 70% of the wastewater treatment operating workforce is going to retire within the next 5 years, because most of them are lifelong employees and were hired during the last major investment in environmental infrastructure, which was during the late 70s. So they're all at retirement age and ready to be done. And an apprenticeship model isn't scalable to a level that allows you to replace 70% of your workforce. Plus, when you lose so many experts, you may also be losing a lot of institutional and tacit knowledge that would be valuable to provide people when they come in. So it's an opportunity ripe for looking at cognitive task analysis as a basis for scalable training. So we built an online simulation that turned out to be far more complex than we ever would have actually signed on to do had we known what we were getting into. But this is for biological wastewater treatment. So basically you have to learn a lot of science, or at least you need to be able to implement a lot of principles of science, because you're creating a bacteria farm for specialized kinds of bacteria that break down the toxins that are in the water and make it safe to put back into into rivers and streams and oceans and whatever else. So we went and got, well, first we got NSF funding, which was very helpful, but then we went and got expert wastewater treatment operators, people who have been working in the field at least a decade, who were recognized by their peers as being exceptionally good, who, when they had a problem that they couldn't solve, these are the people they went to. We spent a lot of time doing cognitive task analysis with them to understand how they did what they did, how they made the decisions that they made, and we then built this software. So one part of the software simulates the biological processes of the treatment plant, because we didn't want something canned where you had closed-ended problems to solve. We needed open-ended problems. So the software actually simulated the whole plant. And so if you increase the oxygen, then the simulator is actually figuring out what that does to the reproduction rate of the of various bacteria over time and things of that sort. We also then took these cognitive task analysis rules and used them as a basis for a sort of artificial intelligence, where every time a student did anything in the environment, the software was looking at what was the state of the simulated biological plant, what cues did that invoke in order to activate relevant expert decision rules that we'd elicited through cognitive task analysis. And it's graphically driven. So in some senses, this is like a classic Carnegie Mellon kind of cognitive tutor, except that they aren't closed-ended problems and it's not a text-based environment. This is an interactive point-and-click, actually manipulate the controls kind of environment with open-ended problems. And so this is some of the graphics for these different pieces, blowers and pumps and aeration basins. If you see this when you're actually doing it and you see that much stuff, brown stuff floating on the top of your basin, you're doing it wrong. Pumps, clarifiers, all kinds of, right? So there are all these different parts of the plant, and the people that we're training need to be able to go and walk through the plant and make the plant work. And so here's that cognitive task analysis. So you're in a particular place, or you're working with a particular piece of machinery. That's one cue, right? There's something specifically that's happening that you need to observe. That's another cue. So you have a place cue, you have a simulation state or a problem state cue. Right? The cue triggers a task. The task has a purpose, so we explain why you'd want to do the task. And then there's a procedure, the step-by-step of how to do it. So somebody is going along. So we have three modes that the software can run in. One is that it's a guided tour, so it walks you through this. Go here, look at this looks this way, therefore do X, Y, and Z things. We have a practice mode where people go through without preemptive prompting, but if they make a mistake, it says, oh, no, you did this, you should have done that, here's the procedure, here's why. And then we have an assessment mode where we don't tell you anything, but Big Brother is watching, and we're getting all that information. So it's this huge cognitive task analysis that's put into this back end that's making both real-time instructional decisions and driving assessment. And one of the things that's neat about this, so when you try to do performance-based assessment and you have checklists, if it's on paper or a virtual reproduction of paper, it's a fixed number of items. Right? It's not like you magically get it. This is not, maybe at Hogwarts they have magically expanding lists based on the problem state, right? But the problem is that if you're following somebody around, if they make a mistake, they've changed the problem. If they put in too much oxygen or not enough oxygen, or they increase the flow or they decrease the flow, or all these things, you've changed the state. The nature of the problem is fundamentally different. And so with a static performance checklist, you can't validly and reliably measure the performance because the situation changed, but the checklist didn't. So what the simulation does is basically create a dynamically generated performance checklist. Given the situation, when you got to that point, what decision did you make? Was it the right decision? And so that's where, this doesn't have a pointer on it. So that's where you can see some of these things say omitted, right? It's because that wasn't relevant, right? Some of these things say order independent. It doesn't actually matter what sequence you do the steps in as long as they all get done. Does it matter if you turn off the lights or turn off the water first? Well, no, you have to do both, right? So some things we can specify as order independent. Some things it really does make a difference. You really don't want to close the water valve before you turn off the pump, otherwise you blow out a pipe. So there are sometimes when order matters, sometimes when order doesn't matter, but all of this can be handled dynamically, all on the basis of this cognitive task analysis, which represents, on average, about 70% of the full expert knowledge that we're able to identify. All that we're able to identify, I estimate about 70% of what there is, which is a far cry better than the 30% we started out with without the cognitive task analysis. So in this case, this student scored 7 out of 16 possible points given the problem state. The person next to him or her in the same classroom could have ended up with 5 out of 12 or 183 out of 319, right? Depending on how many extra steps they introduced into the need to solve the problem. So to wrap up, because I know I'm a little long, so we can leverage expertise by capturing it, and by capturing more than just what experts offer up of their own free will, but by trying to pull out the tacit knowledge, the automated knowledge, that's what actually embodies their expertise. And if we can capture it, we can leverage it through instruction and through assessment in a variety of ways that can lead to higher levels of achievement, that can lead to higher levels of retention and motivation, and can give us assessment tools that are more effective and more authentic to open-ended problem-solving states than traditional approaches. So with that, I'd like to thank my colleagues, my collaborators and graduate students who worked on these projects, as well as the National Science Foundation for supporting the two projects that allowed us to get what you just saw. And with that,